Hey guys, welcome to AP Psych Review on Roblox. This video is going to be fairly fast, so feel free to pause anytime or play along with the game link below. So let's jump right in and get started with Unit 1. Unit 1 sets the stage for everything you'll learn this year. Here we dive into the origins of psychology as a discipline and how it evolved from an ancient philosophy into a modern science. So to start, Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychological laboratory in Germany, which psychological perspective focused on unconscious drives and childhood experiences. That would be psychoanalytical. Structuralism primarily relied on introspection. And functionalism was really focused on how mental and behavioral processes enabled organisms to function. In an experiment, the group that receives the treatment is called the experimental group, which psychologist is associated with behaviors. That would be B.F. Skinner. Remember his Skinner box experiments? And also Carl Rogers is associated with humanistic perspectives. The belief that psychology should only study behaviors was central to the behavioral approach. Which of the following best illustrates a humanistic perspective? Remember that humanism is really focused on personal growth and self-fulfillment. In a psychological study, random assignment is used to give every participant an equal chance in being placed in any group. The principle that knowledge comes from experience and that science should rely on observation and experimentation is called empiricism. And now here are some helpful topics that you should study: standard deviation, bimodal distribution, mode, median, mean, variance, z-score, effect size, and descriptive statistics. So for this next section, pause the video to read the questions and the answers, and then you can follow along. In this case, the mood would be the independent variable since it is the variable that you are changing, and this one would be John Locke. For this one, you're just going to memorize that John Locke is the psychologist in this case. And a confounding variable is a variable that might affect the results without the researchers realizing it. In this case, since the subjects of this research are students, the most ethical approach would be a survey, as natural observation or an experiment would be too invasive. And then for this one, this is basically the same question, and they also shouldn't use a case study, as that is usually for unusual cases. In this question, I see the word cultural, so I can automatically choose social cultural, a little self-explanatory. And the principle that participants must be told enough to make an informed decision is called informed consent. The Little Albert experiment was run by John B. Watson. And here are more study topics that you should study. So we have evolutionist psychology, psychodynamic psychology, basic research, SQ3R, community psychology, psychiatry, counseling psychology, and human factor psychology. And with that, we are finished with Unit 1. So let's head on over to Unit 2. So for the next unit, we're going to dive into the biology behind psychology. So question number 1, the part of the neuron that receives signals from other neurons are called dendrites. The neurotransmitter that is linked to depression is serotonin. The medulla controls vital life functions like your heartbeat and breathing. The master gland of the endocrine system is your pituitary gland. The brain's ability to reorganize itself after damage is called neuroplasticity, and damage to the Broca's area would result in difficulty producing speech. The sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for stressful situations. The brain imaging technique for showing brain activity in real time is a PET scan. The chemical messengers of the endocrine system are hormones. The corpus callosum is responsible for connecting the left and right hemispheres. And the answer for this one is D, all of the above. And now some study topics are parts of a neuron, action potentials, all or nothing principle, serotonin, acetylene, GABA, glutamate, endorphins, your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system, your somatic and autonomic nervous systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, your endocrine system. And let's move on to the next section. The hypothalamus is responsible for regulating hunger, thirst, and body temperature. The occipital lobe is associated with visual processing. Damage to the hippocampus would likely result in problems with forming new memories. And the brainstem involves the medulla and the pons. The cerebellum helps coordinate voluntary movement and balance. Since the student is solving a word problem, then they are using language and logic. Split brain research involves the severance of the corpus callosum, which studies brain lateralization. And again, the corpus callosum connects the left and right hemispheres. The electroencephalogram is best for tracking electrical activity. In this case, the researcher should use an MRI. A PET scan is most useful for showing brain activity via glucose consumption. The fMRI measures blood flow. And with that, Unit 2 is finished. So let's move on to Unit 3. Unit 3 is really focused on sensation and perception, such as hearing, tasting, smelling. Okay, number 1. Sensation is described as the process by which a sensory receptor receives stimuli from the environment. The iris is responsible for controlling the size of the pupil. The minimum stimulus needed to detect a stimulus 50% of the time is called the absolute threshold. The minimum stimulation. Perception is best described as organizing and interpreting sensory information. And two stimuli must differ by a constant percentage to be perceived as different. The tiny bones in the middle ear are called the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, so this question is actually wrong. In hearing, the cochlea transforms sound vibrations into neural signals. Sensory adaptation refers to the diminishing sensitivity to an unchanging stimulus. Two stimuli must differ by a constant percentage to be perceived as different. And proximity is the tendency to group nearby figures. The visual cliff experiment was used to test depth perception in infants. Relative size allows us to perceive depth. And a shape having constant shape is known as shape constancy. And for some useful study topics, we have sensation, perception, bottom-up and top-down processing, thresholds, Weber's law, signal detection theory, subliminal stimulation and sensory adaptation, parts of the eye, transduction, photoreceptors, the optic nerve and feature detectors, parts of the ear, theories of pitch perception, and sensorineural hearing loss, so the disorders. And then which theory explains how the spinal cord blocks or allows pain signals to pass the brain? That would be the gate control theory. Vestibular sense is most closely associated with semicircular canals. And only smell does not route through the thalamus. Kinesthesia is the sense that monitors the position and movement of body parts. Closure is the principle that says we fill in gaps to create a whole object. The visual cliff experiment demonstrated that infants are able to perceive depth at an early age. Retinal disparity is a cue for depth perception. Texture gradient is the depth cue that involves haziness and clarity. And shape constancy explains why we see a door as a rectangle even when it's open at an angle. Color constancy helps us perceive consistent colors under different lighting. And perceptual constancy helps us perceive objects as unchanging despite sensory changes. So the key words for this question are encoding, storing, and retrieving, which are associated with C, memory. And with that, we are on to our second to last unit, Unit 4. So this unit is all about learning and how experiences shape behaviors and understanding over time. Some study topics. And learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. A stimulus that naturally triggers a response is called the unconditioned stimulus. Pavlov's dogs showed that dog salivation can be triggered by previously neutral stimulus. And association is when a previously neutral stimulus becomes associated with a response. Operant conditioning differs from classical conditioning in that it involves associating behaviors with consequences. A conditioned response weakening is called extinction. And in operant conditioning, reinforcement always increases the likelihood of behavior. Negative reinforcement is taken away in unpleasant stimulus to increase behavior. Giving praise is an example of positive reinforcement. Reinforcing a behavior only after a specified number of responses is fixed ratio schedule. Slot machines are random and are not based on time, so it uses a variable ratio schedule. Observational learning is learning by watching and imitating others. Albert Bandura was most associated with observational learning and keyword modeling. In his experiments, children who saw aggressive behavior were more likely to model and imitate the aggressive behavior. And again, some useful study topics here are types of learning, types of stimuli, classical conditioning terms, generalization and discrimination, the difference between the operant behaviors, reinforcement schedules, modeling and vicarious learning, Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, Albert Bandura, generalization, discrimination, shaping, extinction, latent learning. And in advertising, pairing positive images or music for advertising is to use classical conditioning to create a positive association. Giving praise for completing homework is an example of positive reinforcements. Following by observing an example is observational learning. Getting rewarded on a fixed behavior basis is called fixed ratio reinforcement. Learning by observing others is again observational learning. And with that, we can move on to our last unit, Unit 5. So for our final units, it will be about cognitive processes. So how we process, store, and retrieve information, essentially how we think. And according to Atkinson-Shriffin's model, the stages of memory go from sensory memory to short-term memory to long-term memory. A mental set refers to a tendency to approach a problem in a certain way based on past experiences. The Flynn effect refers to the increase of intelligence scores across generations. The intelligence quotient is the mental age divided by the chronological age times 100. So the difference between mental age and chronological age. And emotional intelligence involves understanding and managing your own and others' emotions. The rules that allow us to communicate with and understand others is called grammar. The smallest unit of sound is called a phoneme. Trying every single possible solution is the algorithm strategy. Think about how computers work and how they relate to algorithms. And a mental set, we already know, is the tendency to approach a problem based on past experiences. And some useful study topics are memory, types of encoding, storage and retrieval, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, forgetting, storage decay, retrieval failure, what cognition is, concepts, prototypes, and schemas, problem solving, representative, heuristics, insight, mental set, and functional fixedness, what language is, phonemes, morphemes, grammar, syntax, semantics, the stages of speech, the critical period hypothesis, intelligence, Spearman's general intelligence, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, the types of intelligences, different theories, such as Sternberg's triarchic theory, what IQ is, and according to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, bodily kinesthetic is a type of intelligence. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as supporting existing beliefs. Anchoring bias occurs when people rely too much on the first piece of information received. Framing refers to how the way information is presented influences decisions and judgment. Hindsight bias is a tendency to think that events were more predictable after they happened. Overconfidence bias is to be overly confident in one's judgments or abilities. Functional fixedness is a bias that involves seeing objects as only having one function. And finally, some useful study topics are insomnia, emotional detachment, hostility, post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, obsessive compulsive disorder, dissociative identity disorder, hoarding disorder, bipolar disorder, persistent depressive disorder, autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenic spectrum disorders, hallucinations, anorexia nervosa, substance use and addiction, chronic illness and mental health, positive psychology, lifestyle and health. And with that, we are finished Unit 5, our final unit. Thank you for watching. Remember to study deeper on each topic as this video only serves as a quick review, and good luck on your AP exams.